Okay, you ready?
Yeah, I'm always ready, man.
Welcome to episode 6 of the Connected Lawyer podcast. I am Bryan.
Hey, Bryan, and I'm Aaron. Bryan, we were recently talking about electronic signatures and digital signatures and thought maybe that would make for a good show. So I thought I would just kind of start off by asking you, what are your thoughts on signing documents?
And so I have lots of thoughts on signing
I know
documents.
you
That's a
do.
that's a pretty big category, and I would say just starting off before we talk about any electronic signature service or anything like that, which I absolutely want to talk about and cover. I would say that I've been quote signing my documents electronically for years, in the sense that I scanned in my signature and I just using either insert a picture in Word or a stamp in whatever PDF program that I use, apply that signature. Uh, so letters that I sent out or whatever, unless it was something that absolutely had to be mailed. And honestly, for the last several years, even if I do print it and mail it, I still sign it electronically, because why print it out and then sign it and scan it back in or something like that? That's just too time consuming and too much work. So I just stamp my signature on there and email it or print it or whatever it is I need to do with it and send it out. But and I've been doing that for years. How about you?
Same thing, not as long as you have. For the longest time, I was using an ink pen and just signing paper. And so somebody would have to print it out and sign it. And then, we would end up shredding that paper, so it would end up getting scanned into the file because we really try not to keep, paper lying around. But that's not really an electronic signature. Once you've used an ink pen, you've sort of you've left the world of electronic signatures. Even though the result, once you scan it into the file, that would certainly be an electronic document.
Right.
But the signature on it is not an electronic signature, because to qualify as an electronic signature, it has to be created through an electronic process, right?
No, I agree with you. And honestly, one of the things that really drove me to just signing everything electronically, or whatever you want to call it, putting my signature stamp on it. Let's call it that, because it's clearly not using a signature service or something like that. But one of the things that really drove that was a desire not to have to print out a piece of paper and scan that piece of paper back in and save it in my system. If I create it, save it in my system, and then do something with it, I've saved multiple steps. So I would say, to a large extent, that was driven basically by laziness. Uh, I suppose is the bad way to look at it. The good way is I'm trying to improve my workflow. I think that's how you would say that from a positive spin. But really, to a large extent, that's what drove that. I didn't want to mess with the paper, so I switched that years ago so that I didn't have to.
Yeah, right. And that's kind of that's sort of my whole philosophy anymore. I don't have ink pens. I don't have a printer. There is a printer in our office, but it's not mine, and I'm not allowed to use it or anything like that. Um, I do have a scanner next to my desk, and I always kind of feel like if somebody hands me a paper that I've sort of been assaulted on some level, and usually in a friendly way. It's not not that dramatic, but it is sort of assigning me a task. Right here, throw this away for me, or shred
Yeah,
this for me.
I feel that same way. Like, why are you giving me a piece of paper?
Yeah,
Like, I'll go to CLEs that I'm speaking at, and they used to try to give me a written copy of the materials, which they don't give the attendees and haven't for years, simply because of the expense. But I suppose, it was sort of a thing that they saw as a bonus that they would give to speakers, whatever. And almost always, like, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, why would I want that? You've already sent them to me electronically. Why are you giving me a 3-ring binder I need to carry around and then dispose of when this thing is over with?
Yeah.
So,
Which I will say can be, it can be a personal preference. There can be sort of a pedagogical purpose behind it, or sort of a convenience purpose behind it. And I'll give you an example. That's sort of like what you're saying. So sometimes I'll go to an in-person meeting. It's kind of rare anymore, but you go to an in-person meeting, and a lot of people kind of feel like in-person meetings are more convenient just because of the physicality, and you're there, and you can, there's a lot of things that you don't pick up in a Zoom meeting that you can kind of see. And one of those can be the ability to distribute handouts. And if I'm doing a transaction that feels kind of complicated, just in terms of, there's a bunch of documents associated with this project, sometimes I will create a binder for everybody that's in the meeting that has tabs and subtabs and a table of contents. And it's just kind of nice to say, okay, now we're going to look at, I don't know, just the non-disclosure agreement. And it's at tab C2. So if you could just flip to tab C2 and everybody flips, and it's sort of obvious that we're, literally on the same page. And then I will also say, though, that I provided you with the download link, so you have a bookmarked PDF of this. And if you want to give this back to me at the end of the meeting, we'll recycle the binder, we'll recycle the paper, and that sort of thing. So I do think that just walking through a bunch of documents can be made a little more efficient and a little more user-friendly and intuitive using paper. But there needs to be, I guess what I'm saying is, there needs to be almost like an explained reason why you're doing this, and a mechanism to avoid the paper becoming clutter and waste and things like that in everybody's world. You know what I'm saying? Do you do that?
absolutely. And that's one of the questions that a lot of people ask me about my quote paperless office, which of course has plenty of paper in it. If you see my desk lately, like there's way too much paper on it right now. But my point has always been, I'm not anti-paper. Like, it's a tool like every other tool that we have, and we should use it when appropriate and not when it's not. And don't just keep it around because we get some sort of a sense of security about it. And I see a lot of people who are like that. They treat, pieces of paper as a security blanket. Like, oh, I've got this. This means my file is secure, which is actually not true at all. The what I tell people is, if I need to go to court and we're arguing over a particular motion, I'll print a copy of the motion and take it with me along with, the other briefs or whatever. So I have it. And generally, when I'm done with that, I put it in the recycle bin at the courthouse and go on about my way. I didn't even bother to bring it back to the office unless there's something in it that would be somehow confidential or something, which is typically not the case in documents that have been filed with the court. So I'm all for using paper in an appropriate place. It's just, I think in reality, those times and places are rather limited.
Yeah, I like that phrase, in an appropriate place. And you might even footnote that to say in appropriate circumstances or for an appropriate purpose. And I know, we do want to get into this idea of what's an electronic signature, what's a digital signature, and what are the different ways to do it. But you can't really talk about electronic signatures unless you're also talking about electronic and digital documents. Obviously they go hand in hand. And in terms of this whole idea of paper serving as clutter or other things, another thing that paper can serve as for people is kind of a visual to-do list, and people who aren't using their computer in the best way, or who don't understand, some of these kind of ways to manually order information, like Microsoft List and Microsoft To Do and Trello, all of these applications where you can manually move things around. We talked about OneNote in the last episode, which, by the way, footnote, I'm thrilled with. It's going quite well. Just I said I would report an update, and I'll continue to do that. But it's really nice because it gives you the ability to just sort of manually move things around in this workspace and sort of replicate that control, that feeling of control and visualization and ordering that you get with physical objects, so those are things that it's fine, I think, if you're doing that with paper and you walk into your office and it's nice and neat and uncluttered, and on your desk are these, beautiful stacks of paper that are neatly ordered in order of how you're going to process them. If you're good with it, I think it can make sense, but most people are not, and most people sort of devolve into a life of clutter and paper just sort of being almost an anchor for you, something
Right.
that weighs you down, and it reduces productivity. Clutter it damages productivity and that overall, that sense of mental overhead that we've talked about that kind of exhausts you over the day. Paper's a culprit for that.
It's also quite literally an expense. I did a presentation several years ago for a Chicago title. So I was talking to a bunch of real estate attorneys. So if you've ever been in that group of attorneys, they are, in general, more paper centric than even any other group of attorneys that I've ran into, just in my experience in sort of my practice areas. And I was talking about going paperless, and I asked how many of them had, sort of an off-site storage unit that they stored their old files on because they couldn't fit in the office anymore. And about everybody in the room raised their hand. And then I asked how many of them had a second off-site storage facility that they stored their documents in because the first one got full and they didn't bother to go clean it out. They just rented another one to keep doing it. And I'd say 75% of them in the room raised their hand to that as well. Like they just kept accumulating and accumulating and accumulating the paper. And I'm sure we could have got, to the point where we had 3 or 4 storage units deep for some of these people. But I stopped before I got there and asking that question. But I think that's quite common. I mean, I've seen plenty of attorneys' offices where, half their floor space is dedicated to some sort of a file room, and then they still have offsite storage that literally, once it goes offsite, it's out of mind, out of sight, out of mind, and nobody ever does anything with it anymore, other than go back and every once in a while try to retrieve a file for some odd reason.
Yeah, and it's if you're one of these document warehouse companies, they know, right? Once you have a warehouse full of documents that goes back 10 or 20 or 30 years or whatever, that it's sort of an annuity for them. You're sitting there paying rent and you have to insure it. And of course, if it goes up in smoke, all those documents are gone overnight, so there's that as well. But they know that because the effort it would take to convert and sort and go through all that information is mind-boggling. It's non-billable in the worst way, right? Because you're not, like doing seminars is non-billable and doing marketing activities and basic file management is non-billable, but it feels productive. It's like something that gets you ahead or moves you forward, whatever. Going through a warehouse of 10-year-old documents and triaging them and scanning them just feels utterly just useless, draining.
Right. Wasted time.
Wasted time, right. And so if you could get yourself out of that, not step in the quicksand in the first place, is the ideal solution. But once you have, it's kind of like bite the bullet and just get this, undo this somehow.
Yeah. So I guess that sort of goes back to my general philosophy, which is I try to use less paper rather than more. My philosophy is more scanners, fewer printers, which I think you see a lot of offices where everybody's got a printer at their desk or right outside their office or whatever, and I think that just encourages people to print. Uh,
Yeah, their scanner
honestly,
should be on their desk. The printer should be in the building next door or something like that, right?
right,
Inconvenient.
the far end of the office. And when I used to have an assistant, and when I had her, I decided, like, I'm not going to buy her a separate printer. I have a nice printer. It sits in my office because it's my office and I want it to be convenient to me, and I don't print a lot of stuff. But I just decided there's no reason to buy her another one and incur the toner cost or whatever. And one of the things I discovered, even though the office is relatively small, that inconvenience of having to get up and walk to my end of the office versus hers is an inconvenience. And you think about that. Well, do I really need to print this document, or can I just work with it here electronically? So, yeah, I think there's something to be said about making the printers less convenient and having fewer of them.
Yeah, for sure. And and kind of back to this idea of signatures, right? Because one of the things that causes paper to get generated is the idea that documents need to be signed. And there are different ways to sign them, but the trusty kind of the old-fashioned way is to get out an ink pen and make a wet signature, which has some importance to it. I mean, I think that there's some, I don't know what you call it, but there's some sort of indicia of originality. There's a feeling that comes with holding a document, particularly one that has one of these stamps on it. You can run your fingers over this raised seal. Maybe it's got a wax stamp on it or something. Like if you get a certificate from the USPTO, it always has this gold embossed, sticker kind of thing on it. And the signature obviously made with a pen because you can kind of see how the ink soaks into the paper. So historically, that has made us feel like, okay, this is an original document. Like this is something that is significant in terms of it representing a moment when somebody made a legally binding commitment. And so going through these procedures made that moment significant and made the act of binding yourself in a contractual way, made it significant, right? And maybe electronic signatures are sort of struggling to get that feeling of originality or specialness that that taking out a quill pen and letting the ink soak into parchment paper had, right?
I can certainly see that, but honestly, when I look at a piece of paper that has a signature, I look at it and I'm like, how do I know that person signed it? Because I look at that piece of paper with the wet signature, and what do we have? One signature in ink, presuming it's not notarized or something. We just have the signature. And then I go online and I look at my signature that's been signed using whatever digital signature service we want to talk about. And there are several that I want to get into here in a minute. And I look at it and I know, okay, exactly when it was signed, like down to the second, 1:23 and 43 seconds PM, it was signed. It was signed by somebody who had access to a specific email address that it was sent to. And if I enable, and depending on the service, I can enable, a password. Maybe they had to enter a password in order to sign it. Maybe it kept track of their IP address, so I know what IP address they were when they signed it. Maybe there's geolocation information in there, so I know exactly where the person was who signed that document. And or some other method of authentication, whatever it is that, and the various services offer different types of things. And I look at that and I'm like, oh, well, this tells me a lot more about the execution of that document than this signature in ink could ever tell me.
Yeah,
Which
and
could
in
have
the
been
old days,
done by
right?
anyone.
Don't you need in the old days with just a wet signature, you need a handwriting expert to come in and they look at other things that this person has written, or they sign something right there in court using a similar pen or maybe even the same pen, and they kind of compare them to say, yeah, this person almost certainly is the one who signed it, but that just feels kind of hinky, that really
Yeah.
like the
I,
best
and
they had
and
to work with.
and I actually I had a case many years ago where I had a questioned document, and the examiner I brought in it told me that when they do their examination, the number one document that they like to use for comparison purposes is checks, because people wrote them. They wrote, normally when signing it or whatever, and those worked great. Of course, we're now in the 21st century. Nobody gets canceled checks back at all, and
Right.
nobody writes checks anymore. So even like the preferred method of examining documents has kind of disappeared. And the other thing they like about checks is nobody questions that this is the person who wrote it. Like, this is a legally enforceable, payable on demand document that was signed by the person. So I found that interesting, and that has stuck in my head over the years as we see fewer and fewer checks, and literally you can't get hold of a canceled check anymore.
Yeah. Checks just kind of seem completely ridiculous in this day and age. Here's a copy of my signature along with the account number that has all my money, as well as the routing number that you need in order to take money from said account. It's like, what are we
Let me
thinking
let me
here?
just let me just tell you, both of my children, when they realized that your account number was on your check,
Yeah.
were absolutely mortified.
Right.
Like, why why does this exist? Like,
Right.
you're literally giving somebody access to your account information. This is terrible. We've been told never to do this,
Yeah.
and now I'm going to hand people a piece of paper with it on.
Yeah. And then
So
it used to have your driver's license number and your social security number on it as well.
right.
It's okay. Let's change our processes here. Well, but don't we kind of have a similar problem? Not the check problem, but the forgery problem. Because sitting in between the ink pen signed signature and the stuff you're talking about, which I would consider more towards a secure digital signature, in between that, we have one of these two processes where one, I sign a document and then I scan it in and send it to you and say, okay, magically it's signed. Or maybe even a little more worthy of thinking is where I have a signature file, not a PDF, but like a JPEG of my signature, and I just paste it right onto an Adobe document, or a PDF document, and flatten it and send you that. Anybody who has anything that I've ever signed can scan my signature and then paste it on future documents. So what does that mean? What are we thinking in that area?
So one of my thoughts on that is that as long as you are then transmitting that document electronically, you have some idea that this signature, whether the signature is valid or not. So if I get a letter from Aaron, with your signature on it, but it comes from somebody wholly unrelated to you, their email has nothing to do with you and is unrelated to you, well, then I should be less inclined to trust that that's your signature. If I get a letter from you that's, has your signature stamp on it, and it comes from your email address, and it's dealing with something that we've been talking about, well, then I should have more comfort with that than uh, I would otherwise. And in reality, it's no different from somebody who took a piece of paper and signed it and with an ink pen and scanned it in and emailed it to me from wherever. People could always do that, and people could always copy your signature. So it's not really any different. It's just the tools for forgery have changed slightly, and maybe it's a little easier, but I don't know that that's a reason not to use a signature stamp, because you got to look at other indicia of reliability, I think is sort of how I think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this is a place where you kind of need to unpack and get good and used to unpacking the purposes of a signature. And take that example that you're talking about where I send you a letter, for example. And one thing that I could do is just send you a Microsoft Word document. I could type up a letter. It has your name and address in the header. Dear Bryan, here's a letter. Sincerely, Aaron. And I just send you the Word document. And you would say, well, okay, well, this isn't really a letter. This is a draft of a letter, right? This is a working document that you're
I
using to
I, I
create a
get
letter.
those. I get those from attorneys all the time, though.
Yeah, you do, but it's sort of like, okay, if it's supposed to be a really if it has some importance around it, that's not how you would normally send a letter, right? It's just sort of it's a lesser version of a letter, and so it would be less appropriate for a more important purpose. And so another way to do this would be like, let's just take this in levels of assurance, right? Levels of using a signature for a certification purpose. The next level might be, well, instead of sending you the Word document, I print it to an Adobe PDF. And so now the formatting is locked. Now it kind of has this paper like, this having been printed like feature to it, but it still isn't signed. And so you say, well, okay, so he sent me an unsigned letter. It's just a PDF that has a signature block, but he hasn't signed it. So it's still not completely special. Then the next level would be either I sign it and scan it, or I paste a JPEG of a signature, which in this day and age are almost indistinguishable. So are probably basically the same thing, right?
Right.
But now all of a sudden it says, okay, well, this isn't a draft anymore. This is clearly final, because he wouldn't have put his signature on it in one of those two ways without having proofread it and thought, okay, this is what I mean to say, right? So that's one level of an electronic signature purpose that can be to say, I'm done writing the letter, right? I've proofread it. This is actually what I meant to tell you. And you don't have to worry about whether it's really me sending it to you or whether you need to authenticate it somehow. All you have to know is that what you didn't get was a letter that was half written, right?
Right.
I'm done, is what the signature says. Like over and out. That's what you're saying by putting a signature on it. But interestingly, if you start to get into information security concerns, that PDF is still editable, right?
Absolutely.
It's not a secured document. It isn't digitally signed, meaning that if somebody intercepts it in the meantime and adds another paragraph to it or something like that, and then forwards it on to you, what you can't really do is exclude those kind of nefarious interceptions or hackings or whatever they are. Like, you certainly wouldn't use it for transmitting wire transfer instructions. That's not
Right.
good, right?
Really bad idea.
Really bad idea. So we kind of get into this next level of signature where you say, okay, I'm not going to sign it with a pen and scan it in. I'm not going to paste a signature on it from a JPEG, because those result in a PDF that is still technically alterable, and they don't have any sort of way to verify that I'm really the one who signed it. So the next level of thing that I might do is create, I think they call it a self-signed certificate, which is something you could just make on your own computer. And it's just a little file, like Adobe will let you make a self-signed certificate. And then you run your PDF through that. And you're basically encrypting the document with that certificate, at which point, in order for somebody to alter the document, well, I don't think they can. I think at that point, the document becomes unalterable because it is locked and sealed with a certificate, right? And so now what you've got is like the specialness of the thing being signed, saying I'm done writing, but you also have the specialness of it being a form of encrypted using a certificate that I made. And so now you know that nobody could have altered it in between because it is inalterable. It's kind of encrypted.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking there. Just in terms of like, okay, depending on the situation here, might what the situation is might drive me to choose a different way of signing a document than I would, depending on what I'm trying to say with the signature.
That makes a lot of sense. So, do you use this self certificate regularly?
Yeah, I do. And so Adobe, if you want to make an Adobe signature, Adobe digital signature, meaning I want to send you a PDF that you're not able to alter. And no PDF program will let you do it, and they can't do it because it would break the signature. You'd have to remove the signature in order to alter it. And so if you go through Adobe Acrobat DC, for example, there's a little process where it lets you make an Adobe self-signed digital certificate and you save it on your computer. When you use it, you have to enter a password. So you have to know the password and save it in a password manager or something like that. And it works. It's not just for Adobe, like I was just using it for a different PDF program that isn't Adobe. And you say, I'm going to digitally sign this document. And it'll say, okay, well, what certificate do you want to use? And you say, I want to choose one from my computer. And so then you go in and find I think it's a PKX file or something like that, PDX file. There's a standard format for a self-signed digital certificate. And so you find the one that you made and you open it and it says, okay, what's the password? Because you need a private key in order to deploy this thing. Once you enter the password, then it encrypts. And I say encrypt, what it really does is signed. It's the reverse of encryption. It is encrypting it with my private key so that when you look at it with my public key, which is the key to the certificate I'm giving you with the document, you know that it hasn't been altered because there isn't any way for it to remain sealed, unless it's unaltered.
Right.
It's just basic math.
It is. I have used that method before on occasion to sign stuff. I rarely do that. It's just not. I don't have a lot of use cases for it.
Right.
Instead, if I really need a digital signature, I turn to one of the digital signature services and start using that. Have you ever used any of those services, like DocuSign or Adobe Sign or?
Yeah, we use Adobe Sign, which is Adobe Sign. I think is even the next level beyond the self-signed certificate, because what you don't know from a self-signed certificate is really much at all about who the person is that signed it. Anybody can make a self-signed certificate and they can put my name on it. So it's really easy to forge. All a self-signed certificate says is that this thing hasn't been altered since it was signed, but it doesn't tell you anything about the person who did it. Whereas if you run it through the Adobe Sign system, now it's saying, okay, Adobe is certifying separately from any of us that, yeah, our signature service moved this document through the following email addresses. And so the only way that person could have signed it is if they had access to the email address that I sent it to and received it from, right? That's kind of what they're saying.
So you said you are using Adobe Sign. Have you ever used any other signature service?
Not professionally. Obviously, I've done like banking and they always use DocuSign, which to me just seems exactly like Adobe Sign. It's just one of these things where and if we're talking about the same thing, it's just sort of like I get an email that says, you're being requested to sign a document. You open the document, you can download and print it and read it if you want to. and then you click sign, and it just takes you right to the signature block. You click on the signature block, and you click OK, and it's done, which is beautiful. And so Adobe Sign and DocuSign kind of both work the same way, but I think those are the only ones I've ever done anything like that with.
So, and I know there are a bunch of them out there. I have experience with three. I started using DocuSign. And one of the things I found, one of the reasons I started using it was I discovered that just as with you, nobody has printers anymore. Like if you're dealing with an individual client, the likelihood that they have a printer at home is pretty low in my experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and even if they do have a printer at home where they could print a document that you send them to sign, once they sign it, they have no way to get it back to you other than taking some terribly, poorly shot picture of it with their camera phone and then
and then you get like
to
16 JPEGs or something.
Right. It's just it's awful. So I decided to use. I jumped into the world of DocuSign many years ago, and it works great for signing things like engagement letters, or if I need clients to sign off on a document or whatever it is, I just send it to them. They can sign it and send it back. And honestly, I really liked DocuSign. You compared it with Adobe Sign, and while it does the same thing, in my experience, I found the interface for DocuSign much nicer, and it has some more features that Adobe doesn't have,
But you
including
said
what I
that in
talked about.
past tense. You said you liked DocuSign.
Yes. So what happened was I was using DocuSign, and I was paying them for the privilege, and then Acrobat DC rolled out, and so I got a subscription to that, and I was at a CLE one time when somebody said, if you have a subscription to Acrobat DC, you're getting Adobe Sign for free, and I was like, no, I didn't know that. So I then investigated and found out, sure enough, that's the case. Yeah, a license for pro version of Adobe Acrobat DC, you get Adobe Sign for free, along with it, whatever you want to call it. And that subscription for Adobe DC and Adobe Sign was less expensive than when I was paying for DocuSign.
It's $20 now, right? I think Adobe DC with Sign is $20 a month.
I'm paying like 16, I think it is.
My subscription renewed this year, or I think it was in January, and they said, it was going from $15.99 to $20 a month.
Okay, so maybe I got in before it went up.
Yeah.
So I dropped my DocuSign account at that point and switched to Adobe Sign. And I used it for several years. That's fine. Like I said, I prefer DocuSign, prefer the interface. And then I discovered, we'll put this again under my improving workflow kind of thing.
Sure.
Which is, I discovered that I was terrible about saving those Adobe signed documents back into my file when I got them. Like I get the notification, I'd be like, awesome, it's signed, and then go on with life without thinking about.
But
and so I use Citrix files or ShareFile or whatever they decide to call it this week to store my documents. And Citrix has a e-signature service called Write Signature, and I had investigated it several times, and in my opinion, the amount of money they wanted for it was exorbitant. But I kept going back to it because it has the feature it has is if I go into my files on ShareFile or Citrix files or whatever you want to call it, and send the document for signature from there, when it's signed, it's automatically saved back in the file as a new file that's signed.
Yeah. Okay.
Like there's no, like I get an email notification, but that's just purely for my information. The file is already saved in my file, the folder from whence it originated.
Whereas if you used the Adobe document management system, because you can, right? Adobe Cloud, I think they call it, and you can store documents there. If that was your document repository, then it would do that, but yours is not. Yours is ShareFile.
Right. So I finally swing a deal a couple years ago when they were changing some stuff, and I got right signature, what I thought was a reasonable price. And I've got to tell you that that was fantastic. Being able to not have to worry about
Yeah. So
saving that file.
you say, here, sign this. They sign it, and they file it in your filing system. They
Right.
don't, but that's what happens.
That's
It's like
that's
that.
what happens. As soon as they sign it, it is effectively filed on my in my filing system, and I never have to think about it again. And
That's
that
nice.
so I went from switching to Adobe Sign to save money to switching to Right Signature to spend more money, but to improve my workflow. We'll
And
call
why
it
does
that.
it cost more money though? Why do you think they have a market edge where they can charge more than Adobe does? What are they, how do they sell that?
I presume it's because they're Citrix, and Citrix. I mean, I am not the customer that Citrix is looking for.
Okay.
They're looking for a company that, has, hundreds of employees, and I'm sure they typically sell that at a large discount on some sort of enterprise uh level plan. They don't want me, the solo.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
right. Well, and they tend to market towards, or maybe they don't market towards, but maybe they're used by like hospitals, healthcare entities, because they were one of the first to really stand out in terms of security and particularly HIPAA compliance, which is kind of why I use Citrix ShareFile for that reason. That's a good way, I think, to send and receive documents securely. And they're a company that has a history and reputation for being able to do that well.
Yeah, so I think they just live on that their security they're well known for that, and they're rock solid, and I think that's a well earned reputation. And when it comes to Citrix, I don't think twice about, well, is this going to be secure or not? It's just how much money are they going to be taking out of my pocket?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and and that's what I try to deal with and see if I can work some sort of a deal on it. But the ability to be able to gather those signatures without having to see someone in person, or anyone printing a document, or anyone signing a document, or scanning a document back in, or any of that. It just happens um, all electronically, literally from your smartphone if you want it. It's a fantastic ability. I had a client once who was uh, at he owned some commercial property, and he was negotiating an amendment to a lease, and he and the tenant were literally standing in the tenant's driveway negotiating this lease at like 8:30 one night. And the landlord called me. He's a longtime client, so I took his call, and he says, like, we've reached an agreement, but we need you to document the amendment. And they
Right now
put it off to
in the
me.
driveway.
I Yeah, while they're in the driveway, I type it up, I send it out via whatever service I was using at the time. They signed it standing in the driveway with their smartphones, and we were all done. And uh,
That is something.
oddly enough, that lease and that amendment ended up in a lawsuit a year or two later, because the tenant was just an awful tenant, and we had to sue them. And we had lots of fights with them about everything, but none of the fights involved the digital signatures.
Yeah,
I will
right.
just say that
Well,
was
I was looking at Box. Box.com it's really a nice service. And I sort of had an opportunity over the last month or so to kind of go through their different platforms. They have like a Teams version, not Microsoft Teams, but, for teams
right.
of people. And they have an enterprise version. And I think they have a free version that has, like, you can do 5 digital signatures, box based digital signatures for free as part of their free version. And I was looking at it because we've been using Microsoft SharePoint, not ShareFile, SharePoint. I always have to correct myself on that. That for all of our documents. So basically, which is tied to Microsoft Teams, and that's how we work. So if I'm doing documents, I just put it in a basic Windows folder, that's synced via SharePoint. So it doesn't have any of these kind of extra features that something like ShareFile or Box might have. So I was thinking, maybe we should switch to Box. And then it caught my eye that they had a electronic signature package that is really, that adds a lot of value to it. And I never even thought of the fact that that would allow signed documents to make their way possibly right back into the proper place, so you don't
Right.
have to do any sort of file management. That's pretty slick. I never really thought about that.
And I know Dropbox integrates, I don't know if it's DocuSign or what, but some sort of e-signature service in their platform now as well. Every time I go there, they keep trying to sell me on it, but
Yeah.
they're certainly popping up everywhere and becoming more popular. And one thing I will say is, even with DocuSign, you can sign up for a free DocuSign account and get a certain number of e-signatures a month. I don't know if it's 3 or 5 or whatever it
Yeah.
is. So
If you don't do it that
even
much, right?
yeah, even if you're not a heavy user, if you just want the ability to do it, you can sign up for it and do it for free a few times a month if that's all you need. So if you never tried it, I recommend giving it a try and see how it works for you.
Yeah, and I will say, regardless of the service that you pick, I think all these that we're talking about, I don't have experience with Box, but I have no reason to believe that it's any different from these other services that we're talking about, which are DocuSign, Adobe Sign, and the Citrix ShareFile Right Sign is what they call it.
Right signature.
Right signature. Okay.
Yeah.
So all of these services would work basically the same way in terms of them having an audit trail, that them being inside of a closed, protected system that is sending and receiving signatures from an email box that presumably the signer has control over. And so they can show, not only has this document not been altered since it was signed, but we can identify the person who signed it because we can verify that this transaction occurred completely within our walled garden. And so long as the person that we emailed it to and received it back from has control over their email account, you can be certain that it's an unaltered document that was signed by the person that purports to have signed it. So it has a lot of protections wrapped around it that you can't get with any of these other things that we've talked about, like even an ink pen, or the process where you scan and sign and scan, or print and sign and scan, or where you put a JPEG of somebody's signature onto a PDF and then email it out that way. These are head and shoulders above in terms of verification, authenticity, verifiability, security, all of that. So it feels like every attorney should have this technology. When they're asking people to sign things, unless there's a good reason, you should run it through one of these secure systems, right? That just feels like the way to be going forward.
I agree, and honestly, uh, so one of the use cases I mentioned was client engagement letters. That's one of the things I use it for on almost every engagement letter that I have. And there are two things that drive that. One is, since the pandemic, I have a lot of clients who are happy to meet with me by telephone or with Zoom or whatever, but have no desire to come to my office.
Right.
Okay, I get that. Like
Fine.
the world has changed.
Yeah.
But I found that even when I have somebody come to my office, I would prefer that signature on the engagement letter to be done through one of these services,
Even if they're sitting right there.
even if they're sitting there, because then I don't have to worry about it. Like,
Yeah.
I send it out, they sign it, we both get a digital copy of it. Because I'm using Right Signature, it's automatically filed in my file system. I don't have a piece of paper that I have to do something with. And honestly, in the past, I used to give it to the client, so I didn't have to shred it or throw it away or whatever. But just being able to do that, have it signed, there's no paper, we all get our copies and we don't have to do anything else. That's a great benefit.
It is. And clients like it too. I've one person actually said that to me where, sort of one of the things that we do is send out annual reports, right? I'll go into the Secretary of State, or my office will go into the Secretary of State's platform and file the annual report for a company that, that we're registered agent for. But before we do that, I like them to see the annual report and sign it, and then give us the authority to go ahead and file it for them. And it used to be that you'd send them by paper mail and they'd have to figure out what to do with that and mail it back. And then we went through this intermediary process where we send them a PDF, and then they'd have to do these things we talked about, print it out, sign it, scan it, or whatever. But now they get an email that just says your signature's requested, and they pop it open, they click, and it's done, and it comes right back to me. And he said, "This is amazing. This is so nice. I want everything to work this way," because they don't have to do anything.
Right. It's easier for them. I do that when I do incorporations and I need to get new EINs for a company. You have to, if I'm getting it on their behalf from the IRS, I have to have a signed SS4 in order to get that to act as a third-party designee for them. And in the old days, getting that was a giant pain, especially if they didn't come in to meet with you. Now, I send it to them via right signature. They fill in their social security number, they fill in their address, date it, and we're done. And sign it, and we're done.
Yeah.
So it's so much easier and convenient for everybody involved, including them.
Yeah, it is nice, and I feel like I'm kind of late to the game, because this technology's been there for a while, and you've been doing it for a long, long time. But for me, it really was pandemic driven in some ways. And now looking back, it's kind of like, why was I not on board with this from the very beginning? Right. And I can't explain.
Yeah. The important thing is that you started now. And, when I think about it, I think back to not the first time I used one of these services, but the first time I had to do something like this. And this is the mid 2000s. So I had no experience with DocuSign or anything at all like this at the time. But I was representing a client in a litigation matter, and he spent most of his time in the Caribbean, literally in a hut on the beach. And he had a computer. That was pretty much it. And not only did he not have a printer there really wasn't an option available for him. Like there wasn't a Kinko's down the street where he could go print a document if he wanted to.
This poor guy, I feel so bad for him.
Yeah, I know you feel terrible for him, right? But
all these disadvantages.
We were having to respond to discovery requests, and I know you don't do litigation, but one of the things you have to do is the client has to sign off on them. And literally, we're sitting here and we're like, okay, how are we going to do this? And finally, I'm like, open your email and then just type this paragraph. And I told him what to say, which is, I've reviewed them, and then I swear that everything is true, and then type your name at the bottom of it. And that's what he did for his quote signature, which under Illinois law, a signature, if you intend something to be your signature, it can be your signature.
Sure. X.
I mean,
right.
Yes. Whatever Mickey it Mouse, is.
Whatever.
Yes. Whatever it is that you choose, if you intend that for that to be your signature, it can be your signature. And I had done research on that related to something else. I'm like, your typed signature is as valid as any other type of signature. So do this, and we'll go on.
And that rule's kind of been true forever, right? If you intended for something to be your signature on something, it is your signature. That's all a signature is. Demonstration of intent.
And the cases I looked at when I was researching the topic were from the 1800s. Like, so this is not new stuff. And so that's what we did throughout that entire case. On anything he had to sign off on, I just had him do the email. I'd print out the email, I'd attach it to the document and send it on. And nobody ever questioned it, the entire case, the whole thing. So we've been doing stuff like this for a while. Let's use the tools and make it as easy for all of us as we can. That's sort of my thought on that.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like one of those, I don't know if it's a rare situation. It feels rare where the best way to do something is also the easiest. It's like why are you not doing this?
Right, right. Why are you using a more insecure method
Yeah.
that's more difficult, and you have to find a printer and a scanner and all that?
And
So,
not to make
yeah.
it sound silly, because there is an answer to that. And we've talked about that. Okay, well, I have a dependency or an affinity or just sort of a customization in my mind around this idea of an ink pen. I'm assigning significance to this old way of doing things or this traditional way of doing things. I mean, and maybe somebody says, well, I haven't really thought through or don't fully yet understand this whole idea of digital signatures and encryption and hash functions, and why and how does an electronic signature actually seal up a document electronically to make it have a reliable audit trail and a reliable story wrapped around it that says, hey, this can't have been altered. It can't have this certificate wrapped around it and also have been altered. That is mathematically impossible. And I think the more that people sort of get comfortable with that, the basic mechanics of cryptography and how they work, the more sensible this will be. You'll just say, well, yeah, in retrospect, this actually makes perfect sense, right?
Right. And I think one of the big benefits, or one of the big drivers now, is more mainstream adoption. So as you said, if when your bank sends you a document, you have to do this, then you're going to think, okay, well, if the bank's doing it, this is safe and secure, so
Yeah.
it's okay to do it in some other area of my life.
Yeah, right. Exactly. At least they're the ones on the hook, if you're signing a mortgage
Right.
or something, right? They're the
Yeah.
ones that have to depend on that. So they must be confident, right? They must have looked at it.
Yeah. So, well, I know we've gone a little long. If anyone has any questions, comments, topics, suggestions, etc., feel free to shoot us an email at info@theconnectedlawyer.com. Thanks for joining us. I am Bryan.
I'm Aaron. Thanks everyone. See you next time.